The squad cars surrounded my property like I was some kind of armed fugitive, red and blue lights painting my century-old ranch house in strobing colors. Officer Martinez stepped out of the lead car, his hand resting on his weapon as he approached my front porch where I sat, drinking my morning coffee. "Ma'am, we've received reports of illegal barriers blocking public roadways and potential weapons violations," he said, his voice official and cold. Behind the police line, Patricia Blackwood stood with her arms crossed, her perfectly manicured finger pointing at my ranch gate like she was identifying a crime scene. "That woman is a menace to this community," she declared to anyone within earshot. It's time someone taught her that rules apply to everyone. What Patricia didn't know was that the person who'd be doing the teaching wasn't who she expected. 8 months earlier, I'd inherited my grandfather's 1,000-acre cattle ranch in what used to be the middle of nowhere. Grandpa Joe had built his spreadback when the nearest neighbor was 5 miles away, and the only traffic consisted of cattle trucks and the occasional lost tourist. But suburban sprawl had crept steadily westward, and by the time I moved in, half my property was surrounded by Meadowbrook Estates, a cookie-cutter development of McMansions, where every lawn looked identical and every mailbox matched the architectural guidelines. The contrast couldn't have been starker. My weathered ranch house, built in 1923, sat like a stubborn reminder of the past among houses that looked like they'd been stamped out by machines. My cattle grazed in pastures that bordered backyard swimming pools. My hay barn cast shadows over tennis courts. Most of the new neighbors seemed decent enough city folks chasing their suburban dreams, content to wave politely from their driveways. But Patricia Blackwood was different. She lived in the biggest house in the development, a gaudy monstrosity that looked like a hotel lobby had mated with a shopping mall. More importantly, she was the president of the Meadowbrook Estates, HOA, and she viewed my ranch as a personal affront to her vision of suburban perfection. Our first encounter happened on a Tuesday morning when I was fixing a section of fence that bordered her property. I heard the click of expensive heels on gravel before I saw her marching across my pasture like she owned it. "Excuse me?" she called out, her voice sharp with authority. "I'm Patricia Blackwood, HOA president for Meadowbrook Estates. We need to discuss your situation." I straightened up, fence pliers still in my hand. "What situation would that be?" "This entire operation," she gestured broadly at my ranch. "It's incompatible with our community standards. The smell, the noise, the visual pollution, it's affecting property values for everyone in the development." I felt my jaw clench. "Ma'am, this ranch has been here for 100 years. Your development was built around us." "That may be," she sniffed, "but times change. Progress demands adaptation. I'm sure we can work out some arrangement that benefits everyone." The way she said arrangements made my skin crawl. What kind of arrangement? Patricia pulled out a folder, thick with documents. "I've done some research on agricultural zoning and transition ordinances. With the right approach, you could convert this property to residential use. The land value alone would make you wealthy beyond your wildest dreams." "I don't want to sell." "Everyone has a price," she replied with a cold smile. "And everyone can be motivated to see reason one way or another." Something about her tone sent a chill down my spine. This wasn't a friendly neighbor offering helpful advice. This was a predator sizing up prey. Over the next few weeks, Patricia's motivation campaign began in earnest. First came the complaints to the county about agricultural odors and noise pollution. Never mind that I only had 20 head of cattle, and the loudest sound on my property was the old windmill that pumped water from my well. Then came the petitions. Patricia went door to door throughout Meadowbrook Estates, collecting signatures on complaints about everything from unsightly farm equipment to potential disease vectors from livestock. She painted me as a stubborn holdout standing in the way of the community's prosperity. But Patricia's masterpiece was the emergency HOA meeting she called to address the ranch problem. The community center was packed. She'd clearly done her homework in rallying opposition. I decided to attend, hoping to defend myself and maybe find some reasonable neighbors willing to coexist peacefully. As you can see from these photos, Patricia announced, clicking through slides on her presentation, the Anderson Ranch continues to be a blight on our beautiful community. Rusted equipment, uncontrolled vegetation, and livestock waste creating both aesthetic and health hazards. The photos were misleading at best, outright deceptive at worst. My rusted equipment was a vintage tractor in perfect working condition. The uncontrolled vegetation was a wildflower meadow I'd planted for the bees. And the livestock waste was a carefully maintained compost system that enriched my soil. Furthermore, Patricia continued, we have documented evidence of safety violations and potential criminal activity. My blood ran cold. Criminal activity? She clicked to the next slide, showing photos of my ranch gate. It was a simple wooden structure, painted white with Lazy J Ranch, carved into a sign hanging from the crossbeam. The gate blocked vehicle access to my private road, which wound through my pastures to the ranch house. This illegal barrier blocks emergency vehicle access and violates county road maintenance agreements, Patricia declared. We've also received reports of weapons being discharged on the property in violation of suburban noise ordinances. That's target practice, I called out from the back of the room. It's legal on private property outside city limits. Legal or not, Patricia shot back, it's incompatible with family neighborhood values. Children shouldn't have to hear gunfire during their playtime. The murmur of agreement from the crowd made my stomach sink. Patricia was spinning a narrative that painted me as a dangerous recluse threatening the safety and prosperity of hardworking families. But she wasn't finished. I've been in contact with county officials about enforcement options, she continued. There are mechanisms in place to address situations where individual property owners threaten community welfare. Sometimes the greater good requires firm action. The threat was clear even if the language was vague. Patricia was mobilizing government authority against me, using her position and connections to turn my own tax dollars into weapons for my persecution. After the meeting, I tried approaching some of the residents individually, hoping to find allies or at least neutral neighbors. A few were sympathetic but unwilling to cross Patricia. Others had been completely convinced by her propaganda campaign. It's nothing personal, said one neighbor, a middle-aged accountant named Bob Chen. But we've got kids in the neighborhood. The gun thing makes people nervous. I only shoot targets, and only during reasonable hours, I explained. It's been a family tradition for generations. Maybe traditions need to evolve with the times, he replied uncomfortably. Patricia showed us some disturbing statistics about accidental discharges and stray bullets. I knew those statistics were either fabricated or taken wildly out of context, but I could see the fear in his eyes was real. Patricia had weaponized suburban anxiety against rural traditions, turning legitimate concerns into irrational panic. The harassment escalated over the following months. Patricia filed formal complaints with every agency she could think of, the fire marshal about improper storage of combustible materials, my hay barn, animal control about uncontrolled livestock, cattle in fenced pastures, and the health department about potential groundwater contamination, my perfectly legal septic system. Each complaint triggered official inspections that disrupted my daily routine and wasted taxpayer money. Each time, the inspectors found nothing wrong, but Patricia always managed to spin their reports to sound ominous in her neighborhood newsletters. But her most devious tactic was targeting my livelihood. Patricia discovered that I supplemented my ranch income by hosting wedding receptions and corporate retreats in my renovated barn. It was a small operation, maybe 6 events per year, but it helped pay for feed and veterinary bills. She filed complaints about illegal commercial activity in residential zones, inadequate parking for large gatherings, and noise violations during evening events. The complaints weren't entirely fabricated, but they were blown wildly out of proportion and designed to make continuing the business impossible. Mrs. Anderson, the county zoning inspector, told me after Patricia's third complaint that month, "I understand your position, but we're required to investigate every allegation. Maybe you should consider whether this business is worth the trouble it's causing." The suggestion that I should abandon a legitimate income source rather than deal with one neighbor's harassment made my blood boil. But I was starting to understand Patricia's strategy, death by 1,000 cuts. Each individual complaint was manageable, but collectively they created an unsustainable burden of bureaucracy and legal costs. The breaking point came on a Saturday morning in early September. I was in my barn, preparing for a wedding reception that afternoon, when I heard vehicles pulling up outside. Through the barn door, I saw Patricia climbing out of her BMW, followed by a county code enforcement officer and 2 men in expensive suits. "There she is," Patricia announced, pointing at me like I was an escaped convict. "The woman who's been flagrantly violating county ordinances and terrorizing our neighborhood." The code enforcement officer looked embarrassed. "Ma'am, we're here to inspect your property for compliance with agricultural zoning requirements and commercial activity permits." "Right now?" I asked. "I have a wedding reception in 4 hours." "That's exactly the problem," one of the suits interjected. He introduced himself as a lawyer representing the Meadowbrook Estates, HOA. "This illegal commercial operation ends today." I spent the next 3 hours watching strangers crawl through every inch of my property, taking photos, making notes, and treating me like a criminal in my own home. The wedding party arrived to find their reception venue swarming with officials and their hired photographer being questioned about permits. I had to refund the couple's deposit and watch them drive away to find an alternative venue for their special day. The humiliation was worse than any financial loss. That evening, Patricia knocked on my door with a satisfaction smile and a manila envelope. "I think it's time we had a serious conversation about your future here," she said, pushing past me into my kitchen without invitation. The envelope contained a purchase offer for my property well below market value, but with a twist that made my blood run cold. The buyers were listed as Blackwood Development LLC, and the proposed use was residential subdivision expansion. "You want to buy my ranch to build more houses?" I said. "I want to help you realize the full potential of your asset," Patricia replied smoothly. "This property is wasted on cattle grazing when it could support 50 beautiful homes. Think of the families who could build their dreams here. Think of the commission you'd earn from 50 home sales." Her mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the predatory calculation underneath. "Business is business, Rebecca. You can accept a fair offer and walk away with dignity, or you can keep fighting a battle you can't win." "What's that supposed to mean?" Patricia's smile was pure venom. "It means I have resources you don't, connections you lack, influence you'll never match. I can make your life so miserable that selling to me will feel like a mercy." After she left, I sat at my kitchen table staring at the purchase offer until the numbers blurred together. Patricia Blackwood wasn't just an overzealous HOA president. She was running a sophisticated campaign to force me off my land so she could profit from its development. Every complaint, every inspection, every bureaucratic harassment had been calculated to wear down my resistance until surrender seemed like the only option. But Patricia had made one crucial mistake in her research. She'd spent months learning about zoning laws, permit requirements, and code enforcement procedures. She'd cultivated relationships with county officials and hired expensive lawyers. What she hadn't bothered to investigate was my family. You see, while Patricia was building her network of suburban influence, my younger brother, Marcus, had been building a different kind of career. After high school, he joined the army, served 2 tours overseas, then came home to work his way up through law enforcement. He'd started as a patrol officer in our county, earned his detective shield, then his sergeant stripes, and eventually his lieutenant's bars. 3 months ago, he'd been promoted to chief of police. I hadn't mentioned Marcus to anyone in the neighborhood. We kept our professional lives separate, and frankly, I'd always been proud of solving my own problems without pulling strings or trading on family connections. But Patricia's escalating campaign was pushing me toward a breaking point where pride seemed less important than survival. The morning after Patricia's visit, I drove into town and stopped by the police station. Marcus was in his office, reviewing reports and looking every inch the professional law enforcement executive in his crisp uniform and polished badge. "Becky," he stood up and wrapped me in a bear hug. "What brings you to my kingdom of paperwork and coffee stains?" I told him everything. Patricia's harassment campaign, the bogus complaints, the investigation circus at the wedding, and finally, the purchase offer that revealed her true motives. Marcus listened without interrupting, his expression growing more serious with each detail. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and was quiet for a long moment. "Becky," he finally said, "what you're describing sounds like organized harassment with potential extortion elements. Using false complaints to create financial pressure for personal gain crosses several legal lines." "But she's been careful," I replied. "Every individual complaint has just enough plausibility to trigger investigations. It's death by 1,000 cuts." "Maybe individually," Marcus agreed. "But the pattern tells a different story. And if she's been making false statements to government officials..." He trailed off, but I could see the wheels turning. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking Patricia Blackwood may have outsmarted herself. Give me a few days to look into this." 3 days later, Marcus called with an update that made my heart race. "I had some conversations with the various agencies Patricia has been contacting," he said. "Turns out several of the statements she made in her complaints were demonstrably false. When you file a complaint with a government agency, you're swearing under oath that the information is accurate." Meaning? Meaning filing false reports with government agencies is a crime. Multiple false reports constitute a pattern of criminal behavior. And if there's evidence, she was doing it for personal financial gain. The implications were staggering. Patricia's campaign of bureaucratic harassment had crossed the line from annoying neighbor dispute to potential criminal conspiracy. But Marcus wasn't finished. "There's more," he continued. "I did some digging into Blackwood Development LLC. Guess who else is listed as a principal?" My heart sank. "Please tell me it's not a county official." "County Commissioner Jake Morrison." The same Jake Morrison who oversees code enforcement and zoning decisions. The corruption went deeper than I'd imagined. Patricia wasn't just harassing me with bogus complaints, she was working with a county commissioner who had direct authority over the agencies investigating those complaints. They'd created a closed loop of manufactured violations and predetermined enforcement outcomes. "Marcus," I said slowly, "what does this mean?" "It means Patricia Blackwood and her partner have been using county government resources to commit fraud and extortion. It means they've been violating federal civil rights laws by using official authority to deprive you of property rights under color of law. It means they're going to prison? If we can prove it, yes." "And Becky?" "I think we can prove it." The next few days were a whirlwind of covert investigation. Marcus coordinated with federal authorities. Corruption involving county officials fell under FBI jurisdiction. They set up surveillance, analyzed communication patterns, and built a case that painted Patricia's harassment campaign as part of a larger conspiracy. But the breakthrough came from an unexpected source, Patricia herself. Apparently emboldened by her success in disrupting my wedding business, she decided to escalate her campaign one final time. Her plan was to call in a false report that would trigger an overwhelming police response, creating such chaos and negative attention that I'd have no choice but to sell and leave. The call came in on a Tuesday morning. I was feeding cattle in my far pasture when I heard sirens in the distance. They grew louder and closer until I could see the flashing lights through my trees. By the time I made it back to the house, my property looked like a crime scene from a cop show. That's when I found myself sitting on my porch, watching Officer Martinez approach with his hand on his weapon while Patricia stood behind the police line, savoring her moment of triumph. "Ma'am," Martinez said, "we've received reports of illegal barriers blocking public roadways and potential weapons violations. We need to inspect your property for compliance with county ordinances and possible criminal activity." I gestured to my ranch gate, the same wooden structure I'd inherited from my grandfather. "Are you talking about this?" According to our information, this barrier prevents emergency vehicle access to county-maintained roadways. Behind the police line, Patricia was practically glowing with satisfaction. She'd finally found a way to make me look like a criminal, surrounded by squad cars and under investigation for violations that sounded serious, even if they weren't real. But here's where Patricia's plan hit an unexpected obstacle. "Officer Martinez," I said calmly, "I think there might be some confusion about jurisdiction here." Martinez looked puzzled. "Ma'am? This is private property. That gate blocks access to a private road on land I own in fee simple. The county doesn't maintain any roadways on my property, and emergency vehicles have never had any legal right to access my private road without permission or a warrant." But the complaint specifically mentioned county road maintenance agreements. "What complaint?" A new voice interrupted. Marcus walked through the police line, his chief's badge catching the morning sunlight. The effect on the assembled officers was immediate. Backs straightened, hands moved away from weapons, and the whole atmosphere shifted from tense confrontation to respectful attention. "Chief Anderson," Martinez said, snapping to attention. "We responded to a complaint about roadway obstructions and weapons violations at this address." "And who filed this complaint?" Patricia stepped forward, her confidence intact despite the arrival of my brother. She had no idea about our relationship and clearly assumed she could manage one more government official. "I filed the complaint," she announced. "Patricia Blackwood, president of Meadowbrook Estates, HOA. This woman has been terrorizing our community for months with her illegal activities." Marcus pulled out a notebook and pen. "Could you be more specific about these illegal activities?" "The gate blocks emergency access, the weapons firing violates noise ordinances, and the whole operation violates agricultural zoning restrictions." "I see." Marcus wrote carefully, making sure to document every word. "And you've personally witnessed these violations?" "Of course I have. I live right there." She pointed to her mansion. "I've been documenting everything." "Including emergency vehicles being unable to access county roads?" Patricia hesitated for just a moment. "Well, not emergency vehicles specifically, but the principle." "Ma'am, filing a false police report is a serious crime. Are you certain emergency vehicles have been unable to access county-maintained roads due to this gate?" The trap was perfectly set. Patricia could either admit she'd lied in her complaint or double down and make false statements to a police chief while surrounded by witnesses. She chose to double down. "That gate has been blocking county road access for months," she declared. "It's a clear violation of public access requirements." Marcus nodded and continued writing. Then he looked up at Martinez. "Officer Martinez, could you call the county road department and ask them to identify any county-maintained roads on this property?" Martinez made the call, spoke briefly with someone at the county, then shook his head. "Chief Road Department says they don't maintain any roads on this property." All county roads end at the property line. And Officer Garcia, Marcus continued, addressing another officer, could you check with dispatch about any emergency vehicles that have been unable to respond to calls due to obstructions at this address? Garcia radioed dispatch, had a brief conversation, then reported back. Chief, dispatch has no record of any emergency response issues at this location. The silence that followed was deafening. Patricia's face cycled through confusion, realization, and finally panic as she understood the trap she'd walked into. There must be some mistake, she said weakly. The mistake, Marcus replied, was filing a false police report. Ma'am, you're under arrest for filing a false instrument and wasting police resources. The look on Patricia's face, as Martinez read her rights, was worth every month of harassment I'd endured. Her carefully constructed facade of authority and influence crumbled as she realized she'd been outsmarted by the very system she'd been trying to manipulate. But Marcus wasn't finished. As Patricia was being loaded into the back of a squad car, Marcus approached the remaining officers. I want a full investigation of all complaints filed by Miss Blackwood over the past year. Cross-reference them with actual violations found by inspectors. Chief, Martinez asked, are we looking at a pattern here? I believe we are. And I think we're going to find that pattern extends to other agencies and possibly other county officials. Within hours, Patricia's arrest had triggered a cascade of investigations that unraveled her entire network. County Commissioner Jake Morrison was arrested that evening on federal corruption charges. 3 code enforcement officials were suspended pending investigation of selective enforcement patterns. And Patricia herself was looking at charges ranging from filing false reports to conspiracy to commit extortion. But the sweetest revenge was watching her neighborhood empire collapse in real time. Word of Patricia's arrest spread through Meadowbrook Estates faster than wildfire. By evening, residents who'd been bullied into supporting her harassment campaign were coming forward with their own stories of threatened fines, selective enforcement, and intimidation tactics. It turned out Patricia hadn't limited her schemes to targeting my ranch. She'd been running similar operations against anyone who didn't fit her vision of suburban perfection. The elderly couple who'd planted wildflowers instead of grass. The young father who'd painted his mailbox the wrong shade of blue. The disabled veteran who'd installed a wheelchair ramp that wasn't architecturally consistent with neighborhood standards. All of them had faced the same pattern of bureaucratic harassment designed to force compliance through exhaustion and financial pressure. And all of them had been too isolated and intimidated to fight back effectively. But with Patricia in custody and her corruption network exposed, the victims began organizing. Within a week, they'd filed a class action lawsuit against the HOA, the county, and Patricia personally. The damages they were seeking would bankrupt Patricia and her development company while providing compensation for years of harassment and lost property value. The investigation expanded far beyond my little corner of the county. FBI agents discovered that Patricia and Morrison had been running their scheme in multiple jurisdictions, targeting rural property owners for forced sales that could be developed into high-profit subdivisions. Their method was always the same: identify vulnerable properties, manufacture regulatory violations, create financial pressure through endless bureaucratic harassment, then swoop in with below-market purchase offers from shell companies they controlled. By the time federal prosecutors finished unraveling the conspiracy, they'd identified over 40 properties that had been targeted and 17 forced sales that had generated illegal profits for the conspirators. Patricia's trial was a media circus. Local news stations ran nightly features on the HOA corruption scandal that had bilked rural property owners out of millions of dollars. Her carefully curated image as a community leader was replaced with perp walks and courthouse testimony about greed and abuse of power. The evidence against her was overwhelming. Recorded phone calls with Morrison discussing which properties to target. Email exchanges, planning harassment campaigns. Financial records showing suspicious transfers between her development company and county officials. She was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for conspiracy, extortion, and civil rights violations. Morrison got 12 years. Their various accomplices received sentences ranging from probation to 5 years, depending on their level of involvement. But perhaps the most satisfying outcome was watching Meadowbrook Estates transform after Patricia's departure. The new HOA board, elected in emergency elections after the corruption scandal broke, repealed most of Patricia's oppressive regulations. Residents were finally free to express their individuality without fear of harassment or retaliation. The elderly couple replanted their wildflowers, creating a beautiful meadow that attracted butterflies and birds. The young father painted his mailbox bright red, white, and blue in honor of his military service. The disabled veteran was not only allowed to keep his wheelchair ramp, but was thanked by neighbors who'd been too intimidated to show support during Patricia's reign of terror. Property values actually increased once the atmosphere of fear and harassment disappeared. Potential buyers who'd been scared away by stories of HOA tyranny began showing interest in the community again. As for my ranch, it's thriving like never before. Without the constant stress of harassment and bogus investigations, I have been able to focus on improving the operation. I have expanded my cattle herd, renovated the wedding venue, and even started offering horseback riding lessons for neighborhood kids. The irony isn't lost on me that Patricia's attempt to destroy my property values had the opposite effect. The notoriety from her arrest brought positive attention to rural properties and traditional ways of life. My ranch is now featured in tourism guides as an authentic Western experience, just minutes from suburban amenities. Marcus was promoted to Regional Chief of Police last year, partly in recognition of his role in uncovering the corruption network. He still stops by for Sunday dinner, and we still laugh about the morning Patricia tried to have me arrested in front of the one person in law enforcement who'd never let that happen. You know what the funniest part is? He said during one of our dinners, she could have saved herself a lot of trouble if she'd just asked around about your family connections. She was too arrogant to think she needed to, I replied. That's what happens when you get used to bullying people who can't fight back. The legal settlements from the class action lawsuit provided compensation, not just to me, but to all of Patricia's victims. I used my portion to establish a legal defense fund for rural property owners facing harassment from overzealous local officials. The fund has helped dozens of families fight bogus regulations, questionable enforcement actions, and attempts to force sales through bureaucratic pressure. It's become a model for similar programs in other states where suburban sprawl creates conflicts between traditional land uses and new development. But my favorite part of the fund is its name, the Patricia Blackwood Memorial Fund for Rural Property Rights. It ensures that Patricia's legacy will be helping the very people she tried to victimize. Every morning, I walk out to my front porch with my coffee and look across my pastures toward Meadowbrook Estates. The houses look the same, but everything else has changed. Children play in yards without fear of violation notices. Neighbors help each other with projects that would have triggered Patricia's wrath. The community has become what she always claimed to want, a place where families can build their dreams. The difference is, now they can build those dreams without a tyrant controlling every detail. My ranch gate still stands exactly where my grandfather installed it 90 years ago. It still bears the Lazy J Ranch sign he carved by hand. And it still blocks vehicle access to my private road, just as it always has and always will. But now everyone understands that it's not blocking anyone's rights or freedoms. It's protecting them. Sometimes I get calls from property owners in other communities who are facing similar harassment campaigns. Word spreads quickly about someone who successfully fought back against HOA corruption. I always give them the same advice Marcus gave me: document everything, know your rights, and never assume the person harassing you has more power than they claim. And if they happen to have a brother or sister in law enforcement, well, that doesn't hurt either. The cattle still graze in the same pastures they've used for a century. The windmill still pumps water from the same well. The barn still hosts weddings and celebrations, bringing joy to families starting their lives together. Some things are worth fighting for, especially when bullies think they can steal them through intimidation and corruption. Patricia Blackwood learned that lesson the hard way. And somewhere in her federal prison cell, I hope she's still learning it. The ranch endures, the community has healed, and justice was served with a side of family loyalty. Sometimes the person you're trying to intimidate has connections you never bothered to investigate. And sometimes those connections are exactly what's needed to turn the tables on corruption and abuse of power. The badge always wins over the gavel, especially when the badge belongs to family.